The Regency era wasn't all swirling ball gowns and stolen glances over painted fans. For most, it was a brutal, gilded meat market. You were sold to the highest bidder, or you were utterly invisible. Nora was invisible. So when she saw a man practically dying of thirst in the dirt while the lords and ladies drank chilled champagne 50 feet away, she didn't see a peasant. She just saw a human being. She handed him a cup of water. She didn't know she was handing it to the Duke. The heat of July in the year 1815 was not polite. It did not care for the delicate sensibilities of the English aristocracy, nor did it respect the imported French silk of the ladies lounging on the terrace of Foxwood Hall. The sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air thick, hazy, and suffocating. Nora Hastings sat at the furthest edge of the terrace. She was 23 years old, a dangerous age for an unmarried woman with no fortune. In the eyes of the polite society, currently fanning themselves on the wrought-iron chairs, she was already a ghost, a spinster, a charity case entirely dependent on the grudging goodwill of her Aunt Mildred. Nora wore a faded muslin gown that had been washed so many times it had lost its original blush and settled into a defeated, dusty pink. She didn't mind the dress. It was soft, and unlike her cousin Louisa's heavily boned, jewel-toned silk, it didn't feel like a tailored cage. "God, it is entirely intolerable," Louisa whined, snapping her painted ivory fan shut and tapping it against her knee. "Why my father insisted we attend a country house party before the Duke even arrives is beyond me. We are roasting for nothing." Aunt Mildred didn't look up from her embroidery. "We are here, Louisa, because when His Grace finally deigns to visit his newly inherited estate, you will already be established as a fixture. Familiarity breeds comfort. Comfort breeds proposals." Nora kept her eyes on the horizon. The marriage mart. It always came back to the transaction. Flesh, blood, and youth traded for titles, land, and the right to stand on a terrace and complain about the weather. Nora had failed the market, or rather, the market had failed her the day her father died and left her with nothing but debts. She was grateful for the failure. It gave her a strange, quiet freedom. No one looked at her. No one expected anything of her, other than silence. She looked past the marble balustrade of the terrace, out toward the vast, rolling lawns of Foxwood. The estate was magnificent, but it was currently a chaotic construction site. The late Duke had let the grounds fall into severe disrepair, and the current steward, a viciously ambitious man named Croft, was desperately trying to modernize the gardens before the new Duke arrived from London. To achieve this, Croft had hired 24 local men to dig a massive trench for an artificial lake. They were working in the dead center of the lawn, fully exposed to the brutal midday sun. Nora watched them. The contrast was physically nauseating. On the terrace, silver platters of iced lemon water, cucumber sandwiches, the light tinkling of laughter, and parasols. 50 yards away, men swinging pickaxes in the hard, baked earth, their shirts dark with sweat, their muscles trembling with exhaustion. One man caught her attention. He didn't look like the other laborers. Not in his face, which was currently smeared with dirt and obscured by a ragged, flat cap, but in the way he moved. The other men swung their tools with a rhythmic, defeated slump. This man swung his pickaxe with contained, explosive violence. He was tall, his shoulders broad under a rough linen shirt that clung to his back. There was an anger in his work. He drove the iron into the dry soil as if he were trying to kill it. As Nora watched, the man stopped. He leaned heavily on the wooden handle of his tool, chest heaving. He reached up, pulling off his cap to wipe his brow with the back of a filthy, calloused hand. His hair was dark, plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked toward the terrace. Even from 50 yards away, Nora felt the weight of that stare. It wasn't a look of longing or admiration. It was a look of profound, unadulterated disgust. He looked at the women in their silks, at the footmen standing idly with trays of cold drinks, and his jaw set in a hard, rigid line. "Lazy brutes," Aunt Mildred muttered, following Nora's gaze. She gestured lazily with her fan. "Look at them standing about. Mr. Croft pays them $1 a day, and they lean on their shovels like lords." Nora's fingers tightened on the fabric of her skirt. "They have been digging since dawn, Aunt. In this heat, they are likely dying of thirst." "They are used to it, Nora," Louisa chimed in, taking a delicate sip from a frosted glass of lemonade. "Their constitutions are different from ours, more robust. Like farm animals, really." Nora turned to look at her cousin. Louisa's face was smooth, pretty, and entirely devoid of empathy. It was a willful blindness. They had to view the men in the dirt as a different species. Otherwise, the champagne would taste like blood. Down in the trench, the dark-haired labourer stumbled. He didn't fall, but his knee buckled, catching him against the raw earth of the trench wall. Another labourer rushed over to help him up, but a sharp crack split the air. Mr. Croft, the steward, sat atop a grey gelding a few yards away. He had just snapped a leather riding crop against his boot. "Back to work!" Croft shouted, his voice carrying easily over the manicured grass. "No wages for shirkers. We need this trench cleared by nightfall." The dark-haired man pushed himself off the dirt wall. He didn't pick up his axe immediately. Instead, he turned and looked directly up at Croft. Nora sucked in a breath. She couldn't hear what was being said, but the sheer defiance in the labourer's posture was loud enough. Croft raised the riding crop, pointing it at the man's face. "Pick it up, or you're off the estate without a penny." The man held Croft's gaze for 3 long seconds. Then slowly, he bent and picked up the heavy iron tool. He struck the earth again, and again. But his strikes were losing power. The sun was winning. Nora looked at the silver pitcher of iced water sitting on the table next to Louisa. The glass was weeping with condensation. There were 3 clean tin cups stacked on the bottom shelf of the trolley, meant for the dogs if they grew thirsty. She stood up. "Where are you going?" Aunt Mildred snapped. "Sit down. You are drawing attention to yourself." "I'm going for a walk," Nora said quietly. "In this heat, you will ruin your complexion." "My complexion is the least of my worries, Aunt." Before Mildred could object further, Nora stepped to the trolley. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy silver pitcher by the handle, snatched one of the clean tin cups, and walked off the terrace. The grass was dry and brittle, crunching under the thin soles of Nora's boots as she walked away from the shade of the house. The moment she stepped out from beneath the canvas awning, the heat hit her like a physical blow. It pressed against her skin, heavy and relentless. She kept her eyes fixed on the trench. She could feel the stairs burning into her back from the terrace. She knew what she was doing was social suicide in her aunt's eyes. A lady didn't approach the labourers. A lady didn't acknowledge the dirt, the sweat, or the suffering of the working class. A lady remained above it all, pristine and untouched. Nora didn't care. The cynicism she harboured toward her own society had long ago curdled into a quiet, stubborn rebellion. If she was a ghost to them, then she would act like one. She would haunt their perfect afternoon. As she neared the worksite, the smell of turned earth, crushed roots and sour sweat filled the air. The sounds of metal hitting rock were deafening up close. Mr. Croft spotted her first. The steward pulled sharply on his horse's reins, turning the beast to face her. His eyes darted from her faded dress to the silver pitcher in her hand. He didn't know exactly who she was, merely one of the poorer relations of the wealthy guests. but he knew she belonged to the house. "Miss," Croft said, his tone a mix of deference and annoyance. "The grounds are not safe for a stroll today. There is dust and loose earth. I am not strolling, Mr. Croft," Nora said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. She didn't stop walking. She walked right past the horse, stepping directly to the edge of the jagged trench. The labourers stopped. 10 men, covered in a thick paste of dust and sweat, stared at her in stunned silence. To them, she must have looked like a mirage, a woman in a pink dress holding a pitcher covered in frost. Nora scanned the trench until she found him. The dark-haired man. He was leaning against the dirt wall, his chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. Up close, he looked worse. His lips were cracked and bleeding. The knuckles on his hands were raw. She knelt in the dirt. She didn't care about the muslin skirt. She let it drag in the dry dust. "Here," she said. She poured the iced water into the tin cup. The sound of the water hitting the metal was the loudest thing in the world. The dark-haired man looked up. His eyes were a startling, piercing grey. They were intelligent, sharp, and currently narrowed in deep suspicion. He looked at the cup, then at her face. "It's clean," she said softly, misunderstanding his hesitation. "Please, drink it before the sun warms it." He didn't speak. He reached out. His hand was large, scarred, and trembling slightly from muscle fatigue. His fingers brushed against hers as he took the cup. His skin was rough, burning hot to the touch. He brought the cup to his lips and drank. He didn't gulp it down like a starving animal. He drank it with a strange, controlled desperation. When he lowered the cup, he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a long, ragged breath. "Miss!" Croft's voice cracked like a whip behind her. "What are you doing? These men are not to be coddled. We have a schedule to keep." Nora ignored him. She poured a second cup and handed it to the man next to him, a younger boy who looked no more than 16. The boy took it with trembling hands, whispering a rushed, "Bless you, miss." She turned back to the dark-haired man. He was watching her. The anger that had been radiating from him earlier had vanished, replaced by a quiet, intense calculation. He was studying her face, taking in the faded dress, the lack of jewels, the dirt smudged on the hem of her skirt where she knelt. "You will ruin your gown," he said. His voice was a shock. It was deep, gravelly from the dust, but the accent was strangely crisp. It lacked the heavy, rounded vowels of the local labourers. "It was already ruined," Nora replied, meeting his gaze squarely. "It has been washed too many times. Dirt is an improvement." A faint, almost imperceptible twitch pulled at the corner of his cracked lips. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, keeping his voice below Croft's shouting. "The steward is going to take it out on you." "The steward has no power over me," Nora lied smoothly. "I am a guest, though a poor one." She poured another cup of water and held it out to him. "Drink. You look as though you are about to fall into the earth you're digging." He took the cup again. "It is not my intent to die in a ditch today," he murmured. "Then keep drinking." "Get away from there," Croft urged his horse forward, the animal snorting as it approached the edge of the trench. "You men, back to work, now! And you, miss, I must insist you return to the terrace." Nora stood slowly. She looked at Croft, her chin raised. "If you do not provide these men with water, Mr. Croft, I will return every hour with this pitcher, and I will make certain my aunt speaks to the Duke about his steward's inhumanity when he arrives." Croft's face flushed a dark, angry purple. "The Duke trusts me to manage his affairs." "The Duke is not here," the dark-haired labourer said, suddenly. His voice cut through the heavy air, cold and sharp. He stepped forward, putting himself slightly between Nora and the steward's horse. So perhaps you should heed the lady, Croft. Croft sneered down at the labourer. Watch your tongue, you filthy rat, or I'll have you whipped off the grounds. The labourer didn't flinch. He just stared up at Croft with those piercing grey eyes, a look of such absolute, terrifying authority that for a moment Croft actually pulled back on his reins. Nora felt a sudden shift in the air. The dynamic between the two men was completely wrong. The labourer wasn't afraid. He looked at the steward the way a man looks at a dog that has forgotten its place. Before the tension could snap, Nora turned. She left the pitcher and the tin cups on the edge of the grass. Keep it, she told the men in the trench. She turned and began the long walk back to the terrace. Her back straight, her pink dress stained with brown earth. She could feel the heat returning, pressing against her skin. But she also felt the grey eyes of the labourer following her every step of the way. Gabriel Montgomery, the 7th Duke of Aylesbury, tasted the ice water on his tongue. It tasted like salvation. It tasted like the first honest thing he had experienced in 3 months. He stood in the trench, the harsh sun baking the mud onto his shoulders, and watched the woman in the faded pink dress walk away. He watched the rigid set of her spine, the defiant tilt of her head. He watched as she approached the terrace, where a sharp-faced older woman immediately grabbed her by the arm, shaking her, pointing at the mud on her skirts. Gabriel's hand gripped the wooden handle of the pickaxe until his knuckles cracked. He had been the Duke of Aylesbury for exactly 92 days. Upon his father's sudden death, Gabriel had inherited a vast fortune, 5 estates, and a sickening web of corruption. His father had been a negligent absentee landlord who cared only for the revenue his lands produced, never the people who worked them. Gabriel had suspected the estate managers were skimming profits and abusing the tenants. When he received the glowing, falsely optimistic reports from Mr. Croft at Foxwood Hall, he didn't send a letter announcing his arrival. He didn't bring his carriage or his footman. He arrived on a mail coach in the dead of night, wearing the rough clothes of a dock worker, and applied for day labour at his own estate. What he found was worse than he imagined. Croft was a tyrant. The wages were a pittance, the conditions brutal, and the estate funds were clearly lining Croft's pockets rather than improving the grounds. Gabriel had spent the last 3 days swinging a pickaxe, burning with a quiet, lethal rage, compiling a mental list of every man he was going to fire and every man he was going to send to prison. But he hadn't expected the terrace. He hadn't expected the influx of sycophantic aristocrats invited by Croft to lay the groundwork for a grand welcome. He had spent the morning listening to the high-pitched, vapid laughter of the women and the arrogant drawls of the men, watching them eat iced delicacies while his own labourers collapsed from heat exhaustion. He had hated them all. He had looked at the terrace and seen everything wrong with England, everything he despised about the title he had inherited, and then she had walked out. Gabriel drank the last of the water in the tin cup. The metal was already growing warm. "Who is she?" Gabriel asked, his voice low, directing the question to the older man digging next to him. The old man wiped his face, looking toward the terrace with cautious eyes. "That's Miss Hastings, niece to Lady Mildred, one of the wealthy widows up from London. Poor relation, they say. Ain't got a penny to her name. They treat her like a maid in a fancy gown, mostly." "Miss Hastings," Gabriel repeated. The name felt solid, grounded. "She's a bold one, crossing Croft," the boy next to him whispered, clutching the silver pitcher as if it were a holy relic. "He'll make her pay for that, or make us pay." "Croft won't do a damn thing," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a register that made the older labourer glance at him sharply. Gabriel caught himself, relaxing his posture, playing the part of the weary ditch-digger once more. "Let's get back to it. Pacing ourselves. The steward can scream all he wants." Up on the terrace, the punishment was underway. Aunt Mildred had dragged Nora by the elbow into the shade of the awning, her nails digging painfully into Nora's flesh. "Have you lost your mind?" Mildred hissed, her voice kept low so the other guests wouldn't hear, though Louisa was watching with a smirk of malicious delight. "You walk into the dirt? You hand a cup to a common labourer, like a barmaid?" "They were dying of thirst, Aunt," Nora said, refusing to wince at the pain in her arm. "It was water, not a marriage proposal." "Do not use that tone with me, Nora," Mildred snapped, finally releasing her. She pointed a trembling, ring-covered finger at the muddy hem of Nora's dress. "Look at you. You are soiled. You reek of the outdoors. You have embarrassed me in front of the finest families in the county." "They were not looking at me," Nora replied calmly. "They never look at me. They are looking now. You are a scandalous fool." Mildred leaned in close, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and sherry. "If you think I will continue to house you, feed you, and drag you to these events while you behave like a feral child, you are mistaken. When we return to London, you will find employment. A governess, perhaps, if anyone will have you. But I am done trying to marry you off." Nora felt a strange, cold calm wash over her. A governess. It meant poverty. It meant endless days dealing with other people's spoiled children, sleeping in cold attics, never having a life of her own. But as she looked at her aunt's contorted face, and then over at Louisa, who was delicately nibbling a cake while a man 50 yards away bled into the dirt for her comfort, Nora felt nothing but relief. "Very well, Aunt," Nora said quietly. Mildred blinked, caught off guard by the lack of tears or pleading. "What?" I said, "Very well. If you are done with me, then I am done pretending to be one of you." Nora turned her back on her aunt. She walked away from the shaded tables, away from the clinking crystal and the suffocating perfume. She walked to the far edge of the terrace, leaned her hands against the warm marble balustrade, and looked back out at the lawn. Down in the trench the dark-haired man was working again. But he was slower now. The frantic anger was gone. He swung the pickaxe with a steady, measured rhythm. As if feeling her eyes on him, he paused. He looked up. Across the expanse of dying grass and shimmering heat, their eyes met again. Nora didn't look away. She didn't hide behind a fan or lower her gaze demurely. She looked at him with the honest exhaustion of someone who had just thrown away her entire future and found she didn't mind the loss. Gabriel stared back. He saw the mud on her dress. He saw the isolation in her posture, standing alone at the edge of a crowd that despised her. She was a woman who had nothing, who had risked the little she had left just to give a stranger a cup of water. A slow, dangerous smile finally broke across Gabriel's dirt-streaked face. The Ton thought they owned this world. Croft thought he ruled this estate. Lady Mildred thought she held Nora's fate in her hands. They were all wrong. Gabriel went back to digging, but the dirt didn't feel heavy anymore. The mud on his boots didn't bother him. Let them have their tea. Let them enjoy their shade. The Duke was home, and he was about to burn their perfect little world to the ground. The punishment for Nora's rebellion was swift and profoundly quiet. She was not yelled at again. She was simply erased. Dinner that evening was a lavish 12-course affair in the grand dining room. Nora was not invited. Aunt Mildred had instructed a maid to bring a tray of cold mutton and stale bread to Nora's small, drafty room on the 3rd floor. It was the social equivalent of a firing squad. By morning, everyone in the house would know that Nora Hastings was officially persona non grata. She was damaged goods, cut off from the herd. Nora ate the cold mutton. It tasted like ash, but she chewed and swallowed because starvation was a luxury she couldn't afford. By midnight, the stifling heat of the day had finally broken, leaving the manor draped in a heavy, humid darkness. Nora couldn't sleep. The walls of her small room felt like a coffin. She needed air. She needed something to read, anything to stop her mind from calculating the bleak, terrifying mathematics of a life spent as a disgraced governess. She slipped out of her room. The corridors of Foxwood Hall were silent, lit only by the pale moonlight spilling through the tall, mullioned windows. Nora moved like a shadow, barefoot on the cold floorboards, down the servants' stairs. Her destination was the library on the ground floor. She reached the bottom of the stairs and paused. A sliver of light was bleeding out from beneath the heavy oak door of the steward's office. Nora frowned. Croft was a man who prized his sleep and his port. He was rarely awake past 10. She crept closer, holding her breath. The door was slightly ajar. She pressed her eye to the crack. It wasn't Croft. A man stood by the large mahogany desk. He held a single, shielded candle in one hand, casting harsh shadows across the room. With his other hand, he was rapidly flipping through a thick, leather-bound ledger. He wore a dark shirt and canvas trousers. It was the labourer, the man from the trench. Nora's heart slammed against her ribs. He was stealing. He had to be. Breaking into the steward's office meant a mandatory sentence on a prison hulk, or a hanging if the judge was in a foul mood. She should have screamed. She should have run to the night watchman. Instead, she pushed the door open. The hinges gave a soft whine. The man froze instantly. He didn't drop the book or panic. He just went perfectly still, his eyes darting to the door. When he saw her standing there in her plain white nightgown, her hair falling loose over her shoulders, the lethal tension in his frame dropped slightly. "You walk very quietly for a lady," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, rough whisper that seemed to scrape against the walls of the small office. "You break into houses very loudly for a thief," Nora replied, stepping inside and gently pushing the door closed behind her. Gabriel looked at her. He placed the candle on the desk. "Are you going to call the guard?" "No." "Why not?" "Because Mr. Croft is a cruel man," Nora said simply. "If you are stealing from him, I am inclined to look the other way." Gabriel let out a short, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. He closed the ledger and slid it into a burlap sack resting on the chair. "I am not stealing. I am reading." "You read?" It slipped out before she could stop it. It was a prejudiced assumption, and she instantly regretted it. But labourers who dug ditches for $1 a day rarely had the opportunity to learn their letters, let alone decipher the complex financial shorthand of an estate ledger. Gabriel leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms over his chest. Even in the dim light, he looked massive, dangerous. He didn't look like a man who belonged in a trench, but he didn't look like a man who belonged in a drawing room either. "I read very well, Miss Hastings," Gabriel said. Nora stiffened. "You know my name. You made an impression this afternoon. The men talk." His grey eyes studied her face, dropping to her bare feet on the wooden floor. "They also talk about how the steward will try to ruin you for embarrassing him. Mr. Croft does not have the power to ruin me. My aunt has already seen to that." Nora walked closer, glancing at the burlap sack. "Whatever you are looking for in those books, you had best find it quickly and leave. If he catches you here, he will not just turn you off the estate. He will have you arrested." "Let him try," Gabriel murmured. There was that arrogance again, that terrifying, unearned confidence. "You are a fool if you think you can fight him," Nora snapped, her voice urgent. "He has the law on his side. He has the Duke's backing." "The Duke," Gabriel spat the word like a curse. "What do you know of the Duke?" "I know he is a coward," Nora said bluntly. "He inherits this massive estate, hundreds of people depending on him, and he stays in London drinking wine while his steward starves the workers. He is just like the rest of them. careless, cruel by omission. Gabriel went perfectly still. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He stared at her, absorbing the words. For 3 months, he had been angry at the system, angry at Croft, angry at his dead father. But hearing this woman, this outcast who had ruined her own life to bring a cup of water to a stranger, call him a coward to his face, it felt like a knife to the ribs, and it felt entirely deserved. "You hold your own kind in very low regard, Miss Hastings," he finally said softly. "They are not my kind," Nora said, turning toward the door. "I am nothing to them, and after today, I am less than nothing." She placed her hand on the brass doorknob. "Get out of here before dawn. Take whatever money you think you are owed, and run. The aristocracy does not lose to men like you. They just crush you." She opened the door and stepped back into the shadows of the corridor. Gabriel watched her go. He looked down at the burlap sack containing the ledgers. The proof of Croft's embezzlement was absolute. The man had been stealing thousands of pounds, starving the estate to line his own pockets, and falsifying the records sent to London. Gabriel had everything he needed to destroy Croft. But as he packed the books away, the victory tasted like ash. Cruel by omission. Her words echoed in his skull. He didn't just need to fire a steward. He needed to burn this entire hierarchy to the dirt and start over. And he was going to start tomorrow morning. The house was in a state of absolute, frantic hysteria by 8 o'clock the next morning. An express rider had arrived at dawn carrying a sealed letter with the ducal crest. The Duke of Aylesbury's man of business had written to inform Mr. Croft that his Grace was currently en route from London and would be arriving by carriage that very evening. Foxwood Hall exploded into motion. Servants sprinted down the corridors. The kitchen staff began slaughtering chickens and pulling the finest wines from the deep cellars. Upstairs, the aristocratic guests were in a frenzy of self-preservation and ambition. Aunt Mildred was barking orders at a terrified maid, demanding that Louisa's best sapphire silk gown be pressed 3 times over. Nora sat by the window in her small room, watching the chaos below. She felt utterly detached from it. The Duke was coming. The great invisible god of Foxwood Hall was finally descending from Mount Olympus. Let them panic. Down on the lawn, the panic had taken a much darker turn. Croft was unhinged. The artificial lake trench was not finished. It was a gaping, muddy scar in the center of the Duke's pristine view. If the Duke arrived and saw the mess, Croft's competence would be questioned. Nora watched from the 3rd-story window as Croft rode his horse up and down the edge of the trench, screaming at the men. He had doubled the workforce, pulling stable boys and scullery maids out to haul dirt. The sun was already brutal, a white-hot glare that promised to be worse than the day before. Nora frowned. She leaned closer to the glass. She could see the dark-haired man down in the dirt. He was working, but his movements were different today. He wasn't rushing. He was watching. Every time Croft screamed, the man's head would turn, tracking the steward with a cold, predatory focus. By noon, the heat was suffocating. Nora couldn't stay in her room. She walked downstairs, avoiding the main halls, and stepped out the side door near the kitchens. She didn't bring water this time. She just stood in the shade of a large oak tree, watching the trench. The crack came suddenly. It wasn't the sound of metal on rock. It was a wet, heavy thud. Down in the trench, the young boy, the 16-year-old Nora had given water to the day before, collapsed. He didn't stumble. He simply folded like a broken puppet, his face hitting the hard earth. The digging stopped. The men stood frozen, exhausted, staring at the motionless boy. "Get up!" Croft roared. He spurred his horse to the edge of the trench. "Get him up! We do not have time for this." The older labourer knelt beside the boy, turning him over. The boy's eyes were rolled back in his head. His skin was grey. "He's done, Mr. Croft. He needs shade. He's burning up." "He is shirking!" Croft screamed, his face purple with rage and panic. He dismounted his horse. He gripped the leather riding crop in his fist and marched toward the edge of the pit. "I'll not have the Duke arrive to see a pack of lazy dogs sleeping in the dirt. Get up, boy!" Croft raised the whip. He never brought it down. A hand shot out from the trench. Fingers coated in mud and callous closed around Croft's wrist with the stopping power of a steel trap. Nora gasped, taking a step forward from the shade of the oak tree. It was him. The dark-haired labourer. He had climbed the side of the trench with terrifying speed. He stood on the edge now, towering over the steward. He didn't look tired. He looked like a god of war carved out of dirt and sweat. "Let go of me," Croft hissed, trying to yank his arm back. Gabriel didn't move an inch. The grip tightened. Croft let out a sharp gasp of pain. The leather whip dropped from his fingers into the dust. "He needs water and a doctor," Gabriel said. His voice was not a shout. It was low, conversational, and completely devoid of mercy. "Have your men carry him to the kitchen?" "I am the steward of this estate," Croft spat, his face inches from Gabriel's chest. "You are a maggot digging in my dirt. I will have you hanged for laying hands on me. Guards, seize him!" Two of the estate groundsmen, big men armed with heavy oak cudgels, stepped forward uncertainly. Gabriel turned his head, fixing the groundsmen with a look so chilling they stopped in their tracks. "The boy," Gabriel repeated, looking back down at Croft. He squeezed the steward's wrist. A sickening pop echoed in the quiet air. Croft screamed, falling to his knees as his wrist dislocated. Panic erupted. The labourers scrambled back. The guests on the terrace, who had been watching the commotion, began to shriek. Aunt Mildred clutched her chest, while the men shouted for someone to fetch a pistol. "Arrest him!" Croft wailed from the dirt, clutching his mangled arm. "Kill him!" The two groundsmen finally found their courage and rushed forward. They grabbed Gabriel by the arms. Gabriel didn't fight them. He let them seize him. He looked down at Croft, writhing in the dust, and then he looked up at the terrace. He saw the horrified faces of the ton. He saw the footmen rushing out with muskets, and then he saw Nora, standing by the oak tree. She wasn't screaming. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, realizing exactly what he had just done. He had thrown his life away to stop a whip from striking a child. Gabriel smiled at her. It was a bleak, blood-stained smile. "Take me to the house," Gabriel told the men holding his arms. He didn't sound like a prisoner. He sounded like a king, giving an order. "You're going to the stables, you animal," one of the guards sneered, yanking his shoulder. "We'll chain you to the wall till the magistrate gets here." Gabriel stopped walking. The sudden halt nearly pulled the guards off their feet. He turned his head and looked the man directly in the eye. "You will take me to the house," Gabriel said. The gravelly, rough accent he had been using for 3 days vanished. The voice that came out of his throat was pure, unadulterated aristocracy. It was the clipped, authoritative tone of a man born to rule, polished in the halls of Eton and Oxford. It was a voice that commanded obedience on a cellular level. "And you will do it without touching me again." "Let go," the guard blinked. Confusion washed over his face. Instinctively, violently, he let go of Gabriel's arm. The other guard did the same, taking a step back as if he had been burned. Gabriel straightened his shoulders. He didn't brush the dirt off his clothes. He turned and began walking toward the grand front entrance of Foxwood Hall. The scene on the front steps was utter chaos. Guests were crowding near the massive double doors, trying to see the violent labourer being hauled away, only to freeze in shock as the labourer walked calmly up the limestone steps entirely under his own power. The guards trailed behind him, looking terrified and deeply confused. Croft was being helped up the stairs by a footman, sobbing in pain and clutching his wrist. Gabriel ignored them all. He walked through the heavy front doors into the grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed beneath the crystal chandeliers. He didn't wipe his boots. He left a trail of dark, heavy mud across the pristine white stone with every step. "Stop him!" Croft screamed from the doorway. "He's a madman. Don't let him near the ladies." Gabriel walked straight into the grand drawing room. The room was packed. Aunt Mildred, Louisa, and a dozen other aristocrats were huddled together, smelling salts pressed to their noses. When Gabriel walked in, dripping dirt and sweat onto the imported Persian rug, the silence was absolute. Gabriel stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the gilded mirrors, the velvet curtains, the sickening display of wealth paid for by the blood of the men outside. "Where is the steward?" Gabriel demanded, his voice ringing off the high ceiling. Croft stumbled into the room, pale and sweating. You will hang for this. I will see you hang before the sun sets." "You will be in chains before the sun sets, Mr. Croft," Gabriel said calmly. He reached inside the collar of his filthy linen shirt. He pulled a heavy silver chain over his head. Attached to the chain was a massive, solid gold signet ring. The crest of the Duke of Aylesbury, a roaring lion holding a severed snake, gleamed in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Gabriel tossed the ring. It hit the polished mahogany table in the center of the room with a heavy, deafening clatter. "I have spent the last 3 nights reading your ledgers in the dark, Croft," Gabriel said, his voice deadly quiet. "You have embezzled £6,000 from the estate over the last 4 years. You have starved my tenants. You have beaten my workers. And you have disgraced my name." Croft stared at the ring on the table. The blood drained from his face so quickly, he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling sound came out. The room erupted. Aunt Mildred swayed and actually fainted, collapsing onto a velvet chaise lounge. Louisa clutched her throat, her eyes darting in terror from the mud on Gabriel's boots to the harsh, unforgiving angles of his face. The men in the room stepped back, bowing their heads instinctively, horrified that they had spent the last 2 days sipping lemonade while their host dug trenches in the sun. Your Grace," Croft finally choked out, falling to his knees on the rug. Not from the pain in his wrist, but from the crushing weight of his own destruction. I didn't know." "That is exactly the problem," Gabriel said coldly. "You didn't know. You thought I was a nobody. You thought you could treat a nobody like an animal, and there would be no consequences." Gabriel looked up. He scanned the room, his eyes passing over the trembling aristocrats with absolute contempt. "Get out," Gabriel said. No one moved. "I said, get out." Gabriel raised his voice, the roar echoing off the glass. "Every guest in this house who stood on my terrace and watched those men bleed for your amusement. Pack your bags. If you are not off my land in 1 hour, I will have the dogs chase your carriages down the drive." Panic ensued. The aristocrats scrambled toward the doors, abandoning their dignity, pushing past one another in their desperation to escape his wrath. Footmen rushed in, dragging a weeping Croft away to the cellars to await the magistrate. Within minutes, the grand drawing room was empty. Gabriel stood alone in the center of the chaos. He let out a long, heavy breath. His muscles ached. His throat burned. He looked down at the mud on the rug, the dirt on his hands. He was the Duke again. The power felt heavy, but for the first time, it didn't feel corrupt. He turned toward the doorway. She was standing there. Nora hadn't run with the rest of them. She stood just outside the drawing room, her hands folded in front of her faded pink dress. She looked at the gold ring on the table. Then she looked up at him. Her face was impossible to read. It wasn't awe, it wasn't fear, it was a profound, quiet shock. "A coward," Gabriel repeated softly, echoing the word she had used in the dark office the night before. Nora swallowed hard. She didn't back down. "I did not know." "No," Gabriel said, taking a slow step toward her. The dirt flaked off his boots. "You didn't? You thought I was a starving laborer who was going to die in a ditch, and you brought me water anyway." Nora's chin raised a fraction of an inch. "You lied to us all." "I survived you all," Gabriel corrected gently. He stopped a few feet away from her. The height difference was stark, the physical contrast between his filthy, bruised frame and her pale, defiant stillness electric. "My aunt is packing her carriage," Nora said, her voice trembling just slightly. She was trying to hold on to her pride, the only thing she had left. "I must go. I have no place here." "You have no place with them," Gabriel said. He reached out, his dirt-stained fingers gently catching her wrist before she could turn away. He didn't grip her tightly, just enough to stop her. "Let them leave. You are staying." Nora looked down at his large, dark hand against her pale skin. "Staying as what, Your Grace? A charity case for the new Duke?" Gabriel's eyes darkened. "Staying as the only person on this entire estate who actually saw me." He released her wrist and took a step back, gesturing to the mud he had tracked across the floor. "I have a house to clean, Miss Hastings, and a great deal of dirt to wash off. Have dinner with me tonight, not in the servants' hall. At my table." Nora looked at the man who possessed enough wealth to buy small countries, standing in his own drawing room looking like a vagrant. She remembered the way he had caught the whip. She remembered the way he had looked at her when he drank from the tin cup. A slow, tentative smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Only if you bathe first, Your Grace," Nora said softly. "You smell terrible." Gabriel threw his head back and laughed. It was a loud, booming, joyous sound that echoed through the empty halls of Foxwood, washing away the silence, the cruelty, and the ghosts of the past. The Duke was finally home, and he was exactly where he wanted to be. The sound of carriage wheels grinding over the gravel drive sounded like a death rattle for the old world. Aunt Mildred did not leave quietly. She packed with the frantic, terrified energy of a soldier fleeing a collapsing front line. When Nora informed her that she would not be getting into the carriage, Mildred stopped dead in the hallway, her face a mask of aristocratic horror. "You are throwing away your life," Mildred hissed, her voice vibrating with genuine panic. "He is amusing himself, Nora. He is a duke who plays in the dirt. He is unstable. When he tires of this rebellion, he will return to London, and you will be left here. A ruined woman with no name." Nora stood by the banister. She didn't feel angry. She just felt tired. "I already have no name, Aunt. I was a ghost in your house. Here at least I cast a shadow." Mildred slapped her. It was a sharp, stinging blow that echoed in the empty corridor. Nora didn't flinch. She just touched her cheek, looked her aunt in the eye, and stepped aside to let the footman carry the trunks past. By sunset, Foxwood Hall was completely silent. The suffocating perfume of 40 aristocrats had been aired out. The shrieking laughter was gone. The house felt massive, hollowed out, and finally able to breathe. Nora did not move into the lavish guest suites on the second floor. She stayed in her cramped, drafty room on the third floor. She washed her face, brushed the dust from her faded pink gown, and walked downstairs when the grandfather clock chimed 8. The grand dining room was a cavern. A table built to seat 40 people stretched across the length of the room, gleaming under the candlelight. One place was set at the head. One place was set at the foot. There was a distance of 30 feet between them. Gabriel was already there. He had bathed. The layer of baked mud and sweat was gone, revealing skin that was tanned from the sun and marked with the pale silver lines of old scars. He wore a clean, dark blue coat, but it wasn't a tailored evening jacket. It was simple broadcloth. He had shaved, the harsh lines of his jaw sharply defined in the candlelight. He looked less like a laborer now, but he still didn't look like a duke. He looked like a man who had fought a war and barely survived the peace. Gabriel looked at the distance between the two place settings. He didn't say a word. He simply picked up his plate, his silver, and his glass of wine, walked the 30 feet down the rug, and set them down directly to the right of Nora's chair. "I have had enough of vast, empty spaces," Gabriel said, pulling out a chair for her. Nora sat. The proximity was startling. She could smell soap, clean linen, and the faint, metallic scent of the cold air outside. He sat beside her. There were no footmen hovering against the walls. Gabriel had dismissed them all for the evening. He served the food himself: roast beef, thick slices of bread, and roasted root vegetables. It wasn't the delicate, highly sauced French cuisine Croft had ordered for the guests. It was heavy, honest food. They ate in silence for a long time. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the exhausted, heavy silence of two people who had just survived a shipwreck. "Croft is in the local jail," Gabriel finally said, staring at his wine glass. "The magistrate was terrified when I handed him the ledgers. Croft will be transported to a penal colony for the rest of his life." "And the boy?" Nora asked. "The one who collapsed?" "Sam. The doctor says he will live. He was severely dehydrated. I've moved him and his mother into one of the empty tenant cottages near the South Woods. He won't hold a shovel again. He's going to work in the kitchens when he's well." Nora nodded. She took a bite of bread. "What happens tomorrow, Your Grace?" Gabriel turned his head, his grey eyes locking onto hers. "Do not call me that. Not you. It is your title. It is a title built on the backs of men bleeding in ditches," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "My father squeezed this land dry to fund his gambling debts in London. I inherited a graveyard. I will not have you address me by the title that dug the graves." "Then what do I call you?" "Gabriel." He said it softly, a concession, an offering. "Gabriel," Nora repeated. The name felt heavy on her tongue, intimate, dangerous. "What happens tomorrow, Gabriel?" "Tomorrow I pay the men," he said, turning back to his food. "I pay them triple the back wages Croft stole, and then we fill the trench. The ornamental lake is a vanity project. We're going to divert the stream and build a functional reservoir for the tenant farms. The dry season has been killing their crops." Nora watched him. He wasn't posturing. There was a grim, mechanical determination in his jaw. He was a man trying to dig himself out of the guilt of his bloodline. "You cannot fix it all with money," Nora said quietly. Gabriel stopped chewing. He looked at her. "They don't just need wages," she continued, holding his gaze. "They need a system that doesn't rely on the sudden, miraculous goodwill of a guilt-ridden duke. They need fair leases. They need a steward who is accountable to them, not just to you." Gabriel leaned back in his chair. He studied her face, the defiant set of her shoulders in her cheap, washed-out dress. Most women would have flattered him, praised his generosity, and tried to maneuver the conversation toward marriage. Nora was giving him a lesson in agrarian reform. "You have a sharp mind for estate management, Miss Hastings," Gabriel murmured. "I had an entire life of silence to observe the mistakes of wealthy men," Nora replied. "It is amazing what you can learn when everyone assumes you are deaf." A slow, genuine smile cracked across Gabriel's face. It reached his eyes this time. "Then you'd better come to the study tomorrow morning. The ledgers are a mess, and my mathematics are atrocious." August arrived, bringing a heavy, humid heat that clung to the valleys of Foxwood. But the atmosphere on the estate had entirely shifted. The crushing dread that had hung over the workers like a physical weight was gone. Gabriel didn't retreat to the cool, shaded drawing rooms. He spent his days on a horse, riding from farm to farm, tearing up the exploitative leases Croft had forced upon the tenants, and drawing up new ones. When he wasn't riding, he was out by the reservoir. He didn't swing a pickaxe anymore. The men wouldn't let him, out of a strange, fierce new respect, but he stood in the mud with them, reading the surveyor's maps and pulling his weight-hauling timber. Nora found her own war. She took over the steward's office. The room that had once been Croft's den of corruption became her sanctuary. She rolled up the sleeves of her plain dresses and dove into the catastrophic mess of the estate's finances. She found the hidden accounts, the ghost ledgers, the money Croft had siphoned away. She wasn't a lady of leisure. She was a weapon. The workers quickly learned that if they needed a roof patched or a doctor for a sick child, they didn't wait for the Duke. They went to the office by the kitchens and spoke to the woman with ink stains perpetually smudged on her fingers. Nora didn't offer them pity. She offered them funds, efficiency, and a terrifyingly sharp tongue if anyone tried to cheat her. The Ton, meanwhile, was having a collective aneurysm. Letters poured in from London. Aunt Mildred had spread the tale of Gabriel's madness. The Duke of Aylesbury was living in the dirt. He had thrown out his own class. He was cohabitating with a disgraced spinster who was acting as his clerk. Society was horrified. Nora burned the letters in the fireplace. Gabriel didn't even bother to open them. Their lives intersected in the quiet, bruised hours of the evening. It was late one Thursday night. The rain was beating against the glass of the office window in a heavy, rhythmic drumbeat. Nora was sitting at the mahogany desk, a single lamp burning, cross-referencing a stack of grain receipts. Her neck ached. Her eyes burned. The door opened. Gabriel walked in. He was soaked to the bone. His dark hair was plastered to his skull, and his heavy riding coat dripped water onto the floorboards. He smelled of rain, wet earth, and leather. He didn't speak. He just walked over to the small iron stove in the corner of the office, stripped off his heavy coat, and threw it over a chair. He stood by the heat, his back to her, running a hand over his face. Nora put her pen down. "Is the dam holding?" "Barely," Gabriel said, his voice raspy from shouting in the rain. "The lower pasture flooded, but we managed to brace the western wall of the reservoir. The crops are safe." He turned around. He looked exhausted. The shadows under his eyes were bruised and heavy. He walked over to the desk, braced his hands on the edge of the mahogany wood, and looked down at her. "You should be asleep," he said softly. "I found another £300 Croft hid in a London bank under a false name," Nora replied, tapping the ledger. "It belongs to the estate. I've already drafted the letter to the solicitor to have it reclaimed." Gabriel looked at the ledger, then up at her face. He reached out. His hand was warm, his knuckles still scarred from the pickaxe. He gently wiped a smudge of black ink from her cheekbone with his thumb. Nora's breath hitched. The touch was entirely casual, yet it carried the force of a physical blow. The air in the small office suddenly felt incredibly dense. She didn't pull away. She looked up into his grey eyes. The cynicism that usually armoured her felt terribly thin right now. "You are working yourself to death for a house that isn't yours, Nora," Gabriel murmured, his thumb trailing down to rest against her jaw. "It needed to be done." "Why?" "Because for the first time in my life, I am actually useful," she said, her voice barely a whisper, fiercely honest. "I am not an ornament. I am not a burden. I am fixing something." Gabriel stared at her. The intensity in his gaze was terrifying. It wasn't the polite, measured affection of a suitor in a ballroom. It was a raw, possessive hunger. He saw exactly who she was. He saw the anger, the stubbornness, the brilliant, cynical mind that the rest of the world had ignored. "You were never a burden," Gabriel said, his voice thick. He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "You were the only living thing in a world of ghosts." He didn't kiss her. Not yet. He let the tension hold, letting her feel the absolute certainty of his gaze. He pulled back slowly, picking up a dry towel from the chair to dry his hair. "Go to sleep, Nora," he said, turning toward the door. "Tomorrow the sun comes back, and I have something to ask you." He left the room, leaving the scent of rain and a devastating silence behind him. Nora sat at the desk, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, the ink drying on her pen. The storm broke by dawn, leaving the sky a pale, bruised purple that slowly burned away into a brilliant, cloudless blue. The air was scrubbed clean, sharp and crisp. Gabriel did not go to the fields that morning. He sent a message to Nora's room at 10 o'clock, asking her to meet him by the new reservoir. Nora didn't wear a new dress. She hadn't bought any. She wore a simple, dark blue wool gown she had mended herself. She walked out across the lawns. The artificial trench that had once been a symbol of Croft's cruelty and the labourers' suffering was gone. In its place was a wide, deep reservoir, the water dark and still, held back by a formidable wall of earth and stone. It wasn't pretty. It was brutal, functional engineering. It was exactly what the land needed. Gabriel was standing on the earthen dam, looking out over the water. He wore his dark coat, his boots muddy from the morning walk. He turned when he heard her footsteps crunching on the gravel path. "It holds," Gabriel said, gesturing to the water. 2 million gallons. The tenant farms won't lose a crop to drought for the next 50 years. Nora stood beside him, the cool breeze pulling at her hair. "It's a good piece of work. The men should be proud." "They are." Gabriel looked at her. He didn't look nervous. He looked resolute, like a man who had finally finished clearing away the rubble and was ready to lay a cornerstone. He reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out a velvet box. He pulled out a heavy iron key on a simple leather string. He held it out to her. Nora looked at the key, frowning. "What is this?" "It's the key to the main estate vault, down in the cellars." Gabriel held her gaze. "The deeds, the master ledgers, the family charters, everything that makes Aylesbury function is behind that door." Nora didn't take it. She took a step back, her cynical defense mechanisms flaring up instantly. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because you know how to protect it better than I do," Gabriel said plainly. "Because you tore through Croft's corruption like a knife, and the men trust you more than they trust God. And because I refuse to run this estate without you." Nora crossed her arms over her chest. "Gabriel, if this is your strange, convoluted way of offering me employment as your permanent steward, it's my strange, convoluted way of asking you to be my wife," Gabriel interrupted smoothly. The wind seemed to stop. Nora froze. She stared at him, looking for the joke, looking for the pity, looking for the transaction. She found nothing but absolute, terrifying sincerity. "Don't mock me," Nora whispered, her voice cracking. "I am not a lady of the ton. I have no dowry. I have a ruined reputation. If you marry me, the House of Lords will treat you like a pariah." "I am already a pariah," Gabriel said, taking a step closer. He caught her hand, unfolding her arms, and pressed the heavy iron key into her palm. His fingers closed over hers. "I don't want a lady of the ton. I don't want a woman who cares about drawing-room politics or the cut of her silk. I want a partner who knows how to fight." He stepped into her space, his chest brushing against hers. The heat of him was undeniable. "You saw a man dying in the dirt, and you walked through fire to bring him water," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into that low, rough whisper that unraveled her every time. "You didn't care about the rules. You didn't care about your own ruin. You just cared about what was right." He reached up, cupping her face in both of his large, calloused hands. "I don't offer you London," Gabriel told her fiercely. "I don't offer you balls or the approval of society. Let them rot in their parlours. I offer you this land. I offer you the work. I offer you a life where you are never invisible again. Nora looked up into his eyes. The cynicism, the bitter armor she had worn for years, shattered. It didn't break violently, it just dissolved, washed away by the sheer, undeniable weight of being seen. Truly, completely seen. She reached up, her hands gripping the lapels of his coat. "I'll need a larger desk," Nora whispered. Gabriel laughed. The sound was swallowed by the wind. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a polite, gentle kiss. It was heavy, desperate, and deeply grounded. It tasted of the cold wind, of survival, and of absolute certainty. Nora kissed him back with a fierce, quiet violence, her fingers digging into his shoulders, grounding herself against the solid, immovable reality of the man who had torn down a world just to find her. They stood on the edge of the reservoir, the Duke who had bled in the dirt, and the invisible girl who had saved him, looking out over a kingdom they were going to rebuild with their own hands. Revenge is loud, but a life well lived is deafening. Rowan and Genevieve proved that survival isn't just about weathering the storm. It's about owning the aftermath. Their marriage, forged in ice and spite, burned down the very rules that tried to break them. They didn't just beat their enemies. If you loved this gritty tale of resilience and unexpected romance, tell me your favorite moment in the comments. Hit that like button, share with your fellow historical fiction addicts,